Yeah, it is really true. This is a lot of fun to talk this way. The moral arc of history is that Lower Decks is the best. Hello, interwebs, and I promise you I will not review the whole episode this way, but we are here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, Season 4, Episode 4, Something Borrowed, Something Green. Alright, that's very much enough of that. Let's get into my spoiler-free review, and then we'll get into spoilers in a minute. Being frank with all of you, every so often I come across an episode that I have to review for this channel that I get nervous to talk about. And the reason I get nervous is because I encounter an episode that means so much to me, that I love so deeply, and I see all these things that resonate with me and that I get very excited about, and I worry that when I do these reviews unscripted as compared to my scripted stuff that I do over on my other channel, that I'm not going to be able to express to all of you just how excited and meaningful these stories are to me, and that is where we are at with this episode of Lower Decks. I do not know if this will resonate as much with other people, but for me, this, quite frankly, is right up there with not only my favorite episodes of Lower Decks, like Weed Stooge, but honestly, I think might be one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, period. Just because the story of this episode, which is very much focused on Tendi and finally giving us her backstory, just meant so much to me. And part of the reason why is, number one, it is about my girl Tendi, who is, quite frankly, one of my favorite characters in all of Star Trek, one of my favorite characters ever. I just love her sweet, kind excitement about everything, and just curiosity and willing to stand up for her friends. Just the joy she brings into everything is just what I want to be as a human being in this world, and I love to just live up to who Tendi is. But beyond that, the story that we get for Tendi in this episode is just one that emotionally just hits me to my core so deeply, and not only proves why I love her, but also just it just hits me as a human being, but also just goes to why I love Lower Decks so freaking much, and why I really think that this show, more than anything, just gets what I love about Star Trek so fundamentally. And even beyond that, this episode also explores Orion, which is a planet we've never really gotten a chance to see in any of Star Trek, so it's adding more to Star Trek like lore and mythos. Just this episode does so much that means the absolute freaking world to me, and I'm sitting here about to discuss this episode with all of you, and I feel like I am going to fail at being able to express just all the nuances that this episode just hits me in. And so we'll get into that in the spoiler section, so just know that I adore this episode with all of my heart, everybody. And even beyond that, there is a secondary story here with Boimler and Rutherford that I also found hysterical. It doesn't emotionally hit me, but it was one of the funniest bits I've ever seen Lower Decks do. So even on just a comedy level, without the deeper meaning in it, I thought this episode just had everything. And this is just why I love Lower Decks. This is why I love Star Trek. This is why I love Tendi. Just this episode is just everything to me, and I just love it. And again, I hope it resonates with you as much as it did me. But this episode I'm going to hold dear because I freaking love this episode. And just thank you to all. I know some of the Lower Decks people watched this review, and to all of you who work on Lower Decks, just frankly, thank you. Thank you for this episode. Thank you for the show. Thank you for this character. I very much love this. I'm going to cry. So let's get into spoilers before I do that. Okay, like I said, I'm a bit nervous about this, so let's just get into this. I'm going to just say screw it. I'm going to rant for as long as I need to rant. This will probably be a long review, but fuck the algorithm. We'll deal with it. But I want to just really dig deep into why this works for me, and I'll probably get a second chance when I do my written review at the end of the season on my main channel. But let's just go for it here because there's just so much I want to talk about. Unfortunately, I have to start with my one criticism of the episode, which sucks. But we do start off the episode with a reiteration of the season-long arc that's been going on this year, with the ship coming in and attacking different alien ships and supposedly blowing them up, but we'll see if that's actually what the case. I've talked about my theory of that and back in episode 1. But this is a lot of fun seeing this Orion ship vignette where you get to see what Orions do on their own ships. I love that the dude Orion is the one that is sort of getting picked on because we know that Orion Society society is very matriarchal, so it sets that up very well. And he's just kind of like, no, I'm a pirate, I steal things. Like, oh, you're more like a plagiarist. I thought that was very funny. Like, the bolts in the head was a nice reference. So it was a good reiteration of what Orion culture is like, very matriarchal, very pirate, before we get into Tendi. So it sets that up very, very well. The thing that I didn't, and this is my only major critique of the episode, really, the only thing I didn't like is it is again very reiterative of what we've seen with this arc so far, where it attacked the Klingon ship and it attacked the Romulan ship. On both occasions is the same setup of, like, we see a little vignette, the thing comes, it blows them up, their ships get attacked. Again, I get that it's setting up that arc, it's showcasing this is happening over and over again and the same thing is happening, but I just wish there was a little bit of just structural difference, because it's the same exact structure, just with a different alien flavor. Here it works better because at least the Orion stuff is fitting in with the overall themes of the episode, so it works better here than it did elsewhere. And not to say that it was bad, but it is my one critique, is just wish it would switch it up. Okay, that is my one critique of this episode that I loved. Let's move on. Okay, before we get to the, like, stuff that, like, is the meat of why I love this episode, let me focus on the more fun stuff so that I can focus on the deeper things. And that is Rutherford and Boimler's storyline. I thought this was very sweet that, like, Boimler and Rutherford just get along super well in the quarters. Again, I love Lower Decks, just earnest kindness. Like, these two people, they don't have a lot of conflict. It's they just really care about each other, and they love everyone's idiosyncrasies. Like, Boimler being like, no, you're talking in your sleep, like, actually comforts me. Like, it was just so sweet. I just love the platonic love of each other. And I love that their only argument comes over who gets to water the bonsai tree. That feels very Rutherford and Boimler, and that they would get overly upset over who gets to water the damn thing. Just very them, and very just, oh my god, you adorable little boys. You're my little adorable boys. But then they go to the holodeck, and this is where I lost my shit. The twin twains. They, like, just doing the whole bit the whole time was wonderful. And, like, the little kid who was there judging them whenever they didn't, like, stay in southern accents was great. Like, I am so here for all of that. Just died.
Well, I know what you say, that this is a vessel of exploration and that your mission is to discover new worlds.
And the moral arc of history, like, just all of it was great. And I love that they were able to find common ground through that, because they were both doing this ridiculous voice, and, like, you can have it on the oddens and I'll have it on the evenings, and, like, just great. Again, it is very sweet that these two are able to work out their differences through the most nerdy, idiosyncratic of ways, and also very Star Trekian of ways. Just perfect Lower Decks, perfect Star Trek. Again, why I love this show so much. But then they go up to the bridge, they encounter Freeman dealing with this alien who won't let them scan this, like, once-in-a-lifetime anomaly, and so they're like, oh, we have a way to get a compromise. And the guy comes down, he's like, he's in the twin twain outfit, he's like, arr, arr. I loved it, and Freeman's like, what am I supposed to do? And they'll just try a southern accent, and the guy's like, that was a southern accent, just... That is so perfect. But they solved the thing by he eats their poor bonsai tree, and, like, oh no, I thought was great. And then I loved the end of the episode resolution is them like, well, we can't do the twin twains anything anymore, so because we're just banned from it, Freeman. But we've found a new thing to do, and it is doing Mozart together, and just let us tickle the ivories, yes. And I'm like, just perfection, absolute perfection. So it's a very short arc with those two, but, like, legitimately I thought this was, like, a masterpiece of comedy. I was dying, and it also showcases, like, that earnest kindness that I think just no other show other than Lower Decks embodies more. And I adored it. But this brings me to the heart of the episode, and that is everything to do with Tendi and on Orion. So again, let us break this down. I apologize if I gush too much and I missed something, but I have so much to talk about here. So we start off their segment where the three gals, Mariner, Tendi, and T'Lyn, are hanging out in the bay, and they actually finish the work. Like, being lieutenant junior grade means that they get to actually finish their work early, and Tendi's like, let's do something fun. And here's something that I really, really liked and sets off this episode very subtly in a smart way. Again, this is where I'm gushing at things. T'Lyn says it is illogical to celebrate a life without purpose, or to not have a purpose. Now, this line, I think, to me, is very important on several levels. first off, if any of you watched my review of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, the big essay that I did over on my other channel, it was 3 hours long, so I understand if you didn't. But my big problem with that season of Strange New Worlds overall, even though I liked it generally, was that there was this constant reiteration of a theme throughout the season of, hey, you should trust Starfleet. You find your purpose through Starfleet. Starfleet is what gives us meaning. There's even the musical episode of the season was we know our purpose is to trust in the mission. That was like the whole theme of the musical episode was like, give yourself to Starfleet and it gives you purpose. And I personally, especially as a trans person, I know, as a trans person, but we'll get to why that's important for this episode in just a minute. But especially as a trans person, I am always very critical of storylines that say trust the system. Trust this thing that we, even as we saw in that season of Strange New Worlds, Starfleet doesn't always do right by people. And especially since Starfleet is very much like an echo of America, and we see, Discovery and other Star Trek shows being very critical of it in a way that's like, we can make this better. We can help it grow. We have to look right at its problems. And Strange New Worlds not really doing that, and having saying you find purpose through this system, it was my big critique of that season. And so with T'Lyn here saying it is illogical to celebrate a life without purpose, that is that's reminding me of that theme that Strange New Worlds had. And it will come back in Tendi's arc in just a minute about how Tendi had a purpose in her life because the system told her to. And ultimately she feeling like she didn't fit the purpose that the system was telling her to have. So like, this is a very subtle line, but it's very important, I think, not only for even fitting my critique of Strange New Worlds, but also like how Star Trek has sometimes been used because, well, we'll get to it. Let's go into the actual episode. I'll talk more about that theme resolving towards the end of this episode. But we get that Tendi has to go back to Orion because there's her sister's having a wedding, and Freeman says, we want to have good relationships with the Orions because one of their ships got attacked. And I love Mariner being like, look, we need to learn your backstory. Come on, it'll be a good way to learn. And T'Lyn getting in, I was like, yeah, I can do like an anthropological study for Vulcan. Like all of this, and Tendi just being like, oh man, all right, I don't want to show you the real me. Because Tendi thinks the real her is what she was supposed to be for her society, by her parents, by the system that she was born within. And so she sees that as the real her. And so she doesn't want to reveal that to her friends because she feels embarrassed by it. Coming back to that. They go to Orion, and I love that we get to like learn that Tendi is very embarrassed by the fact that she's like very rich. She's one of the opulent people. And again, the subtle like references to the matriarchal nature of Orion, like all the men carry, Mariner, Tendi, and T'Lyn, and the mother is very clearly the one in charge in Tendi's family. I love meeting her parents, and the father's just like, oh, I can't worry. Like he's the very worried one, the one who clearly doesn't have like the domineering presence. And this is something that we learned from Star Trek Enterprise, right? Like it was the Enterprise show did an episode called Bound where we learned that the Orion women were the one in charge, and they just pretended to be slaves using their pheromones to like trick men.
No one is coming to attack your ship. Please release us.
Now, this was a very problematic episode of Enterprise where it was trying to do the like, look, we're trying to fix the sexism of the 1960s show where we had Orion slave women, which is itself very problematic, but then doing like, but we make the men slaves and that's equal, right? It's like...
You finally realize that. Yes, Captain, you've been operating under a misconception. It is the men who are the slaves, not the women.
No, that's fucked up. Too. Just because it's happening to men doesn't mean that it's not sexual assault or manipulative or still enslavement. It's still messed up. That's a very reductive way to talk about these issues. And so this is like Lower Decks trying to like walk that line of like a matriarchal society that like places Tendi as like the prime of her culture because she is the head, like the eldest in the family, presumably. So I love like Lower Decks kind of like commentating on that and kind of showcasing what that's like and what the problems with it are in this society, even for the women. We'll come back to that. Sorry, there's a lot we're coming back to. This is a very smart episode. But then we go to this bar because Tendi has to look for her sister who's been kidnapped, and something's up because Orions aren't supposed to be kidnapped at that time. And I love that that's like a part of Orion society, that women just get kidnapped is like a part of the marriage ceremony, but it's not right at this moment. So Tendi has to go to like this bar, and I love that it's like what was it called, like double cross or something like that. And like Mariner's like, oh, they don't even have a pun, that shows strength. And like everyone just bowing down to Tendi, and it like being very obvious, even though Tendi's trying to play it down the entire time. It's like very clear, and I love the recurring joke that Mariner just keeps getting hit in the same shoulder with a knife over and over and over again in every situation. Just killed me. That was great. But then we meet the head of the bar that Tendi sort of like does this drinking with, and I have to say, Murder Bug drinking game, coolest freaking thing I have ever seen. I love how like nonchalantly good Tendi is at this and everything. We got hints at it in the Deep Space Nine episode of last season, but like Tendi's very good at what she does, and she just tries to downplay it, but even when she's like casual, she's very good. And like even when the other head of the bar like fails at it, she like saves her life. She's like so good that she can like save someone else's life even while winning the game. I thought like just the coolest damn thing, and I love it, and I love just Tendi's constant embarrassment. But then we go to the hump dungeon, as Mariner calls it, and they have one in New Seattle, which is very funny. And like this is very common on Orion because like they're a very, very sex forward society, as we know from, you know, Gene Roddenberry 1960s storytelling.
How does stimulation of the olfactory nerves affect the enjoyment of sex?
But again, this is like, we learned that this is the moan dungeon, where like dudes get hopped up on moans and controlled by women. It's a very like dominatrix sort of thing. And again, I like it's a walking a line because it is very problematic that you set up this society, and this is Enterprise's fault, not Lower Decks' fault, of like women controlling men and them not being able to consent to it. And so this is like the episode like still saying like that's a problem, men are being controlled, and kind of joking a little bit about it, which is, you know, skirting the line. But it also shows that like men have some level of consent in that like they want to be controlled. They're like, yeah, I wanted to be a moanhead. So like it's a level of like trying to address this very problematic story in Enterprise and being like, well, they are doing it consensually. It kind of reminds me of like, you know, BDSM culture or, you know, dominatrix culture, where it's like, you know, consensual non-consent sort of things, and like setting up the rules of like you can do plays of like non-consensual stuff. You just have to set it up to, you know, what the rules are, and you're consenting to a situation where you're going to play act at non-consent. So it's like trying to like frame it in that aspect. And it doesn't do it perfectly because you're still dealing with like pheromones and stuff, but I think it's like a trying to find a healthier way than Enterprise did to do that, which I liked. But I also liked that like Tendi is embarrassed by it, and Tendi saying that she doesn't have or she doesn't like to use pheromones, which I'll circle back to that later on, why that's important to me. I know I'm like putting pins in a lot of things here, but we'll get to it. But like she's saying, oh, I don't have I don't use the pheromones unlike other women, and part of it could be like she's embarrassed, but I have another read on it that we'll talk about in a second. But then and I love the jokes here where she's just like, lick my foot, to like this head of the moan dungeon, and she is just controlling all these guys, like all I have is my stink, because Tendi sort of gets away with the pheromones, but they learn where to go next. And this brings us to the sweetest thing, which is Tendi has a Starfleet ship that she used to play in with her sister, and that's how she fell in love with Starfleet. So this is going to bring me to, we get this conflict with Derica, who Derica sort of reveals that Tendi was, you know, assigned assassin at birth, that she was supposed to be this big assassin for the society, and Tendi chose not to take that on. And this is ultimately what I want to talk the most about, because, well, like I said earlier, there's that discussion of purpose, and society's having a purpose for somebody, and that my problem with Strange Worlds being like, oh, the system has a purpose for you. This relates to Tendi because she was told she had a purpose. She was told to be an assassin. She was literally assigned assassin at birth, and she didn't want that. She found who she really was being a Starfleet officer, and Mariner and T'Lyn reiterate this to her, right? They literally say, the real you is the science person. It's not the real you being this assassin. The real you is the person who actually really loves Starfleet and had to hide it from her family by playing in the Starfleet ship, but ultimately the real you was that person, and you chose this life. And this sort of negates this idea of you being a purpose that you have for the system, right? Tendi did not choose her purpose, her use for society. She self-actualized and chose what she wanted to be. Choice is important. And this is the distinguishing point that I was trying to make in my Strange New Worlds video about, like, Starfleet and Star Trek should always be about enabling your weirdo self, enabling the best you can be. Gene Roddenberry said himself, his actual quote is like, the worst thing that could happen to us is we are all pressed into molds. And Starfleet is about not pressing everyone into a mold for Starfleet, but allowing you to be your own best weirdo self, being your own human being. And I think that's something that Strange New World misses, but Lower Decks always gets. It's his love of the weirdo self and how Starfleet is here to enable you. And Tendi's backstory of having rejected that and becoming part of Starfleet because that's what she chose to be, that's who she really is so beautiful and wonderful. And I've said over and over again that I, like, as a trans person, I relate to this quite often, and I think that should be very obvious. Like, I'm gonna put a queer reading on Tendi right now, a trans reading on Tendi. And why I love reading Tendi as trans is you can do Tendi as trans allegorically, which is episode helps a bunch, but also explicitly. When we talk about, like, allegorical trans representation, you know, we look at something like, you know, characters in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, people who feel like outside of the system but want to self-actualize even though they're told to be a certain way for the system. And that's what Tendi is here. You know, she was assigned assassin at birth and chose to transition to something else. And she even had to, like, hide her Starfleet love as a kid by going and playing in a Starfleet ship elsewhere so her family couldn't see. And that relates to me as, like, many queer people. Like, we hide our queer selves. Like, I dressed up in women's clothing so my parents couldn't see whenever they weren't home, to just, like, be my real self and feel like I could connect to something that felt like actually me, not who I was supposed to be as a boy. And so I was assigned male at birth, as Tendi was assigned assassin at birth. And so, like, allegorically, Tendi relates to a trans experience in a lot of ways. And I talk about in my main channel a lot of the time, like, how trans experiences are not just transgender people experiences, but I think all of us feel this way. Everyone, whether you're trans or not, whether you're queer or not, we all feel like under, you know, capitalism, patriarchy, you know, whatever have you in our society today tries to put us into boxes and tell us to be a certain way. And ultimately we try to be ourselves, and sometimes we will, and ultimately some people will try to, like, be the best thing, like be a strong man and, like, double down on that, and violently reject, you know, anything of, like, a vulnerability or being themselves. And some people will follow who they actually are, whether you're trans, whether you're cis, whatever. And so it's about, like, everyone feels that way, which is why I love allegorical trans storytelling. But what I also love about Tendi in this episode also just makes that consistent for me is that you can read Tendi not only allegorically trans and why I relate to her so much, but explicitly trans as well. I mean, like, she has a dead name, the Mistress of the Winter Constellations. You know, she doesn't use pheromones, which you could read as just her choosing not to use pheromones, but also could be like, maybe she doesn't have any because she was like, she just doesn't have them because she was assigned male at birth. You know, there's like a lot of ways you could read, if you wish to, Tendi being explicitly trans. But what matters more to me and why I love this episode so much is that it is Tendi also allegorically representing that trans experience. But I also love the nuance here because we learned D'Erica, like, was doing this whole thing to get Tendi back because D'Erica actually felt like she could never live up to who Tendi was. And this, and she actually wanted to be an assassin. She wanted to be the Prime. And I love how it showcases, like, the fact that Tendi had this role that D'Erica felt like she couldn't ever actually be because she was not considered the Prime. She always feeling she was living up to it. It's like even people who are fulfilling the roles that they're supposed to have for society feel like they aren't doing well enough. They feel like they aren't doing well enough compared to, like, other people who are supposed to be that way. And so there's, like, this very subtle understanding that even those who were, like, fit the system and the system works for also still feel oppressed by it, and how even those who transition away from something like Tendi did to go and join Starfleet can still be good at the system. They don't you know, leave a system because they're bad at it. Like, I was a Boy Scout. I literally became an Eagle Scout. I won the award for best boy. I could have been the best boy out there, but I didn't. That's not who I was. I'm a trans woman, and so that's why I transitioned. And Tendi's, like, the best at what she's doing, but she transitioned anyways. And so I love D'Erica also learning that she's really good. She can beat Tendi. She's great at what she does as well. Loved all of that, and then ending the episode with them going to the marriage. I also loved T'Lyn, and this is a subtle thing with T'Lyn's arc too, her throwing away the report and saying it would be unethical to, you know, file a report without the subject's consent, which is not something I feel like most Vulcans would do. Most Vulcans we've seen in other shows, like, science comes first. That's the only important thing. So we already saw this in season 2 with T'Lyn. She's a little abnormal for a Vulcan, and I like that there's a subtle connection there of, like, T'Lyn also feels outside of the system, even though she is also a full Vulcan. She's not Spock. She's not seen as biracial or whatever. She's not put in that box as, like, an outsider to the culture based on, bullshit genetic ideas. But she is still abnormal in terms of her behavior outside of being a Vulcan, why she got sent to the Cerritos in the first place. So I love that like small arc for T'Lyn here as well, and then just showing solidarity with Tendi was super sweet. And then Boimler and Rutherford being jealous that they didn't get to go at the end was also wonderful. So yeah, I like I said, I've ranted a bunch about this episode, but I hope I have been very clear in expressing like why this episode meant the world to me. And maybe it won't resonate for you if you don't love Tendi, or maybe don't resonate with the trans reading as much, and that's totally okay. But for me, I am going to seriously cherish this episode because it just on so many levels, just my love of Tendi as just like her personality I resonate with, but also her being a trans allegory I resonate with, her being potentially an explicit trans allegory. I know the show doesn't need to ever make it explicit. I would love if they did, but they don't ever need to. I read her as trans explicitly, and I love that. But more importantly to me, like allegorically, she reads that way, and I resonate with her story. But then that also connecting to Starfleet, my critiques of Strange New Worlds in a subtle way, even though I don't think that was intentional, but like that little bit there, T'Lyn's arc as well. And then also just on this episode, just the weird, dorky, lovable bromance between Rutherford and Boimler, just being kind, sweet, caring people who work things out by being weirdo dorks. That also resonates with me. Like just talking this all out, I think I may have another favorite episode of Lower Decks. It used to be Weege Dooge. I think it might be this, just because how much this episode just hits me personally on every level. Not just Tendi, but with Rutherford and Boimler, all of it. Like, it just hits on every level what I love about Star Trek, about Lower Decks specifically, about storytelling, about being alive, about being a human being, about caring for others. Like, this just captures it. And I can already tell I'm going to watch this episode again and again and again. I love this episode. I love Lower Decks. Yeah. So that's my thoughts on this episode of Lower Decks. Thank you for indulging me my big rant on this episode, but I loved this so much. So with all that said, I wish you all a wonderful, my brain's dying now. I just live long and prosper, everyone. Mwah. I love you all.